Tuesday, April 30th, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. This morning I'm going to talk about the big lie about inflation, that inflation is low and that everybody would like to see inflation higher, as Christine Lagarde, IMF director, said the other day. I mean, that's the the biggest joke of the year, I think, so far. Look at the definition of inflation, how the mainstream economic, how can I say, mainstream economic sector has actually corrupted the word, how politicians have corrupted, how the central bankers have corrupted, and I'll look at the definition of inflation, how it's changed over the decades. This is an old Merriam-Webster dictionary from the 70s. And I'll look at the massive shrinkflation of the FT, or Financial Times, one of the newspapers that's also talking about the fact that there's not enough inflation. And I'll also look at one of the treasury securities that is used by the central banks and Wall Street to manipulate the perception that there is no inflation. Before that, I'll quickly go through the markets, see what they're doing this morning. It's just before 7:30 a.m. London time. Yesterday, another all-time high for the S&P and NASDAQ, but even though the markets didn't go up that much, they did make new highs, all-time highs. S&P was up 3 points, NASDAQ 15, and the Dow was up 11. This morning we got spot gold at $1283.30. That's up about $3.50. Range has been $1279 to $1284.40. Silver $14.94, up about 3 cents. High has been $14.98 and the low $14.89. The Dow is down 3 points. So fairly quiet so far here this morning. S&P future is down 5 points, or 0.15%. NASDAQ 100 future is down 0.75%, or 58 points. Yeah, I think there was a headline, something about Google. Google dropped in the aftermarket. Currencies. The dollar actually came off a little bit yesterday against the pound. The pound right now is unchanged. It's at 129.33. So we were just below 129 at the end of last week. Euro 111.80, down about 6 pips. So virtually unchanged. Dollar is down about 0.2% against the yen, 111.42. Dollar up 0.12% against the Chinese yuan at 674.67. Crude oil, Brent and WTI crude are virtually unchanged this morning. WTI is 63.44, Brent 71.38. Yield curve also unchanged. We've got the 10-year yield at just below 251, and the 3-month yield to the 7-year, it's about 4 basis points inverted. Of course, the Fed FOMC meeting starts today. The press conference will be tomorrow. Inflation. So there was a quote by John Maynard Keynes, and this is what it says, and I'm quoting now. Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily. And while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. Well, that's the 1%, right? They're able to, they get the phony money first, and they speculate with it. They put it into hard assets, tangibles, precious metals, and I think nowadays a lot of people know that there is inflation. The economic class, economist class, the PhD economists, central banks, monetary authorities, they're all talking about the fact that we don't have enough inflation, and everyone everyone's looking, everybody would like it to be higher. That's what IMF's Lagarde laments. Highly mysterious low inflation. Well, Mrs. Lagarde, all you need to do is go into shadowstats.com and see how they've manipulated well, not only, they've manipulated the data, the CPI data, which they now call inflation, and they've manipulated the definition of inflation, because the definition of inflation, if you look at my old dictionary here, and I've spoken about this before, I've made videos about it, so this is not a first. It says, an abnormal increase in the volume of money and credit, resulting in a substantial and continuing rise in the general price level. So, what have we had since 2008? Well, we've had an abnormal increase in the volume of money and credit. So, but that's not called inflation anymore. They've corrupted the meaning of the word so that they, by doing QE and printing money and creating credit out of thin air, by inflating derivatives, they don't have to use the word. They call inflation now the consequence, which is rising prices and CPI. And by doctoring CPI and keeping it low, and how do they doctor it? I highly recommend shadowstats.com. You see that if we go back to the way they calculated CPI back in the 90s, the CPI would be around 6%, which would reflect the inflation we've had in the last 30 years, and especially in the last 11 years with all the money and credit that's been created. So they've changed the definition, of course, of the word, so they can trick people into thinking that there is no inflation. You look at the meaning now of inflation. It says here, I've got it from Google, inflation is basically a rise in prices. A more exact definition of inflation is a situation of a sustained increase in the general price level in an economy. Inflation means an increase in the cost of living as the price of goods and services rises. No, they're talking about the consequences of inflation, which is the rise in the amount of money and credit in a debt-based system, right? Many people forget that in Britain, from the early 1700s to just before World War I, the purchasing power of the pound there was no inflation because the pound was fixed to a weight of gold. We had sound money. Many people don't realize you don't need inflation to have prosperity. So why are these central bankers, these phony economists, calling for higher inflation? Well, because they're tricking you. Because if they don't keep inflating, which they are, the whole system implodes. So they have to lie to people and pretend that there is no inflation so they can keep inflating, or else the house of cards collapses. Yeah, the FT. I bought it yesterday. I usually never buy the FT. I bought it because I want to talk about an article here in the FT for another video. It doesn't need to be right away. But I remember when the FT was less than £1. I couldn't find a picture of the front page of the FT in the UK where it said that it was 70p. I remember it being 70p, but I did find one from the US edition from September 13th, 2001. I had to, that was a big event, so they've kept pictures of the front pages about 9/11. You can see in the USA the FT was $1. So at that time, you know, the pound was about 160 to the dollar. So yeah, it was around 65, 70p. But now it's £2.70 here, the FT, as you can see here, that I'm not making this up. It's 270 right here, £2.70. And I can tell you, it's only got one section now, and a small little section here that is not even the same size. I remember when I used to buy the FT, when I worked in the city and read the FT, the first section was thicker, and then you had a second section that was the same, you know, amount of pages as this one. So they shrunk it completely, and the price is more than tripled in the last, I would say, even 15 years. The price has tripled. So there you go. There's the inflation there. I also recently, well, there's the consequence of inflation. That's the thing. Price is rising. And more proof here, and this is from the BBC News. I don't use the BBC website that much. This is the consequence of inflation here. April 2009. And Germany is supposed to have almost no, very little increase in their CPI, or as people call it now, inflation. But look at this. Berlin protests. Thousands gather for march against rising rent prices. Estimates say housing costs in the German capital have doubled over the past 10 years. Protesters are calling for local government to seize properties owned by private landlords. Some campaigners have already launched a petition calling for a referendum on the issue. So interesting that it's in the last 10 years. What have we had in the last 10 years? Well, we've had this massive increase in the in money and credit. We've had a QE by the ECB, by the Fed, Bank of England, by Japan, and the financial class has been getting money for free, money out of thin air, you know, and they've been basically legally confiscating these properties and ramping up the rents. So some might say that asking for seizing private property is wrong, but the way they, you know, the financial sector has bought the properties through inflation is also wrong. So just to finish off, I'll show you how the other way that they manipulate the bond market is through something called TIPS, T-I-P-S, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. There you go. This is what Investopedia says about it. Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, TIPS, is a treasury bond that is indexed to inflation to protect investors from the negative effects of rising prices. Well, they say rising prices. The principal value of TIPS rises as inflation rises. Inflation is the pace at which prices increase through the US economy as measured by the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. So they don't use the money, you know, the increase in the money supply and credit to protect investors. No, they use the CPI, which we know is fudged and is complete fabrication and is not inflation. And the other thing that the central banks do is that, you know, because there are options on these, they're just like normal treasuries. They're traded. There's a very liquid market. So the central banks actually, I remember years ago, the New York Fed talking about how they could sell volatility in the TIPS to get, you know, to make sure that people's perception of inflation was not elevated. So they're manipulating the yields in these. They're manipulating CPI, all to keep this lie about inflation from coming out. But it will come out, and that's when I think things will get very interesting for the financial markets. Inflation, they've changed the definition of the word. They've made the consequence of inflation is inflation now. So the CPI, the rise in prices, is called inflation. And they tinkered with the measure And it's all a big lie, and we all know it. And I don't think they're going to be able to keep it going forever. And I think one of the big consequences of this are movements like the Yellow Vest, because one of their main complaints is that they can't afford to live anymore. Well, why? Not because there isn't any inflation, because the consequences of inflation are making it very difficult for them to make a living. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Make sure you hit the little notification bell to be notified of all my new videos. You can also follow me on Twitter, Steemit, and on DTube. I wish you all a great day. Take care. Bye.